So you're noting, of course, that Waterfall has its limitations. You mentioned a silver bullet, which makes a lot of sense. With that in mind, what do you think is the key to making it work? What's behind a successful Waterfall implementation, if I may ask?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think we obviously work both waterfall and agile, so we get to see the relative merits of each. But from the point of view of waterfall, I do think that for it to be effective, there's got to be a real focus and a real rigor and discipline in the way that the requirements in the early stage of the project are gathered, and equally the way that they're prioritized. Because what you've got to do with a waterfall project is you've got to learn enough up front to make sure that if you're building something new, you're laying strong architectural foundations for that solution and thinking about them deeply enough to make sure that once it's built, it's strong enough to be able to accommodate the addition of new features without risking a lot of rework and rebuild. But it's also then about making sure that the features that sit within that architecture in the first part, the initial phase of the development, when you're starting from a blank sheet and you're moving towards a launch position for a new product, is basically about working out with a real rigor which features are going to be the most valuable. So the way that we would typically work with a waterfall approach is that we would really lean on the idea of establishing what is the minimum viable product, or MVP, another one of these project management terms. But essentially all that means is working with the client to understand what is it about that product that's going to add the most value, firstly to the client as an organization and a business from a commercial perspective, and secondly, in pursuit of those goals, what's going to add most value to the user to drive engagement or return visits or whatever it is. The benefit of that means that by being really focused and really rigorous, you can get that time scale, that waterfall life cycle, to be as short as possible, and therefore avoid the risk of waterfall, which, as I mentioned before, is when you've got a situation where you've got a spiraling massive amount of requirements, which are all flowing through one delivery pipe, if you like. And by the time the requirements get to the end of that pipe, they basically are out of step with the business. So by being really, really focused on that, that helps to mitigate that risk. In other words, sorting out what are the must-haves from the nice-to-haves. Probably the projects that for us have been the most successful have been the ones where the client themselves has been prepared to challenge their own perceptions about what is a must-to-have versus what is a nice-to-have. And that can be sometimes quite difficult to differentiate between. And part of our role is to help with that decision-making process. But if it's done right, that can give a real sort of focus and momentum to the requirements gathering, and basically make sure that everybody understands their role in that and the likely demands on their time as that project moves through its life cycle, because everybody's very focused on what those must-haves are. The moment you start to add too many requirements that require too long to deliver, you end up with scope creep, you end up with the project inevitably being delayed because of too many external dependencies, or just sheer delivery fatigue. Projects that go on month after month after month, are subject to people tiring of them and starting to question whether the value of the solution's right. And the trick really, if I was to sum it up with Waterfall, is to utilize the fact that if we're working in a digital context, it's actually a lot easier to moderate the scope of a website or an app or another type of digital product than it is to moderate the scope of something in another industry. You can't build a house without putting a roof on it, to give an example. So, as I say, in summary, to make Waterfall work, focus on the minimum set of requirements that you know are going to add the most value and apply the Waterfall to that, meaning that when you've completed that Waterfall project, you can then move into Agile to enhance and build upon that.